Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and today I have with me a guest born in Germany, cuddling in from Wales. I'm going to pronounce her name the American way, Andrea Hamill. And she's written the book, The Kindertransport, What Really Happened. And this is a topic that I've known about for years and years, but learning more and more all the time. So I want her to tell us what really happened after she explains the different kinder transports for a minute.
Thank you very much, Phyllis, for having me. Yes, well, there were many initiatives to obviously rescue people from Nazi Germany, but there were also many initiatives to rescue children. So initially, most of the refugees tried to settle in neighboring countries, countries with land borders with Germany. And these countries were obviously France or Belgium or, well, the Netherlands. And a number of children managed to flee to these countries with, due to varying initiatives, some with their parents, but also some with schools, but some were also unaccompanied minors, like the Kindertransport to the UK. There was also an initiative to save children by rescuing them and letting them find refuge in the US. But that there was a so-called bill, and the so-called Wagner-Rogers bill, which failed, really. People wanted to rescue far more children, so in the end, it ended up only being 1,000 children, which compared to the 10,000 that went to the UK, a much smaller country, is obviously not a large number. This does not mean that no Jewish children were saved by coming to the US, and generally that it is much more complicated. And there's other colleagues who are working on that. My expertise is the Kindertransport to the UK.
Which started, can you remind us?
Yes, so it started, well, the initiative really started after the so-called November pogrom, Crystal Night, Night of the Broken Glass, on the 9th and 10th of November 1938. There were the discussion had been had on how to save Jews from Nazi Germany in the UK, and there were various groups of people who tried to help people come to the UK. But after the annexation of Austria, it was really very difficult. The UK, I mean, it had been quite difficult all along, but it became more difficult in April 1938 because the British government was very much more concerned with keeping people out because they did not want to have large numbers of Jewish refugees. There was anti-Semitism in the UK. Also, they didn't want people who wouldn't contribute to economic life in the UK. So really, it was the pressure from ordinary citizens in the UK who read about the November pogrom in Germany and by then the annexed Austria, and put pressure on the government saying that they wanted them to do something to help the Jews under pressure in the German Reich. And there were discussions at the highest level, British government, the Society of Friends, the Quakers put pressure on. There were a small number of MPs, members of parliament, who lobbied, but then also the Jewish community. The Jewish community had been helping refugees settle in the UK financial ways, on organizational ways, ever since 1933, really. And they were also lobbying the government. And there was a debate in parliament very soon after the November pogrom, so on the 21st of November 1938. And in that debate, it was discussed how they could help the Jewish refugees from Germany. And really, the only thing the government was willing to do is let in children, unaccompanied children. So these were children who did have parents, they did have families. They weren't all orphans. There were some orphans, but most of them had families and parents. But the UK decided they would only admit children. Now, this was the question that has been debated a long time. Why did they do that? Part of it was clearly due to economic reasons. There was high unemployment in the UK, so they thought, if we let children in, they wouldn't compete with British workers on the labor market. So this would be easier. Another reason really was that they also didn't expect them to cost the state any money, because what the Kindertransport really was a visa waiver scheme for unaccompanied children. And the organizations that organized the Kindertransport in the UK, they were charitable organizations. They were not governmental organizations. And they not only, yeah, I don't know, privatized the organization of the Kindertransport, also the financing. For each child, you had to have a guarantee, which is sort of a bond of £50, which in today's money is about £3,500. So now I'll let you translate that into dollars. I'm not an expert on that, unfortunately. And you had to, so there was a large sum of money, and you had to raise that for each child that was to be admitted to the UK. And the first, so that debate happened on the 21st of November, 1938, and the first Kindertransport arrived from Berlin on the 2nd of December, 1938. So everything happened really quickly. The November pogrom, the 9th or 10th of November, the debate, end of November, the first Kindertransport arrives on the 2nd of December. And we don't have the exact figure, but we believe it was just over 10,000 children that arrived, found refuge in the UK through this scheme. The Kindertransport ended, and again, there's new research on this, ended at in really, it's complicated, but it ended when the Second World War broke out in Europe, so in September 1939. And the children arrived on trains, but not all of them arrived on trains. Some actually arrived by boat, and some later on in 1939, children were also rescued from what was then Czechoslovakia. Some of them arrived by plane as well. And all of the costs, they all had to, there was a huge fundraising effort. They had to fundraise for these guarantees, but also for the cost of the travel and the cost of the upkeep of the children. And there was a big sort of appeal for donations by the former Prime Minister, British Prime Minister Lord Baldwin, as the so-called Baldwin Fund, which did raise 500,000 British pounds, which obviously very large sum of money in those days, in 6 months. So really, the ordinary citizens of the UK, they are actually in some ways the heroes of the Kindertransport. They really helped. They put pressure on the government. Then they gave money. Obviously, some people could only afford very small amounts of money. And then they helped with organization, and some of them also fostered these children.
I have a question. I just
Yes.
realized I didn't prepare you for it. I think I saw it in a play years ago.
Mm.
But is it true that there was a train en route from Berlin on September 1st, 1939, that was stopped at the border and they don't know what happened to those children?
No, that story is not quite correct. There was a train that was already prepared to leave Prague station exactly on that time, 1st of September 1939, and that train was prevented from leaving.
From leaving Berlin.
No, Prague,
Oh, so
not Berlin.
okay,
Yeah,
so it was
Prague.
a train
No, it was
coming from.
Czechoslovakia. It was, and that train was prevented from leaving. So that is true, and we do not know exactly. I mean, we do know of some individuals, and some individuals were perished in the camps quite clearly, but we don't know, obviously, of everybody who was on the train. But there's new research, and there were also some later transports that came from the Netherlands and to the UK. So it's not as clear cut that this September, but what we had thought of traditionally as the Kindertransport to the UK, certainly when the Second World War broke out, that certainly you can sort of say that came to an end.
So there was no missing train at the border though.
No, there wasn't a missing. Not that I know of. No. I mean, you learn every day.
Right, I
Maybe
know.
the train who was prevented from leaving, that the train that was prevented from leaving, that had was definitely a train from Prague station.
Okay, now what is the focus of your book? This is a history program and not a book program. But what is
Yes.
it that you feel that we should know and understand?
Well, I think, like I already said, what I feel people have to learn about the Kindertransport is that it's not just a feel-good story. And that is certainly how it was always told for a long time in the UK. That and it is certainly not a story that puts the UK government in a particularly wonderful light. Now, we all know the UK government is not exceptional. A lot of other governments, including the US government, they were not particularly generous at admitting refugees. And the UK government wasn't either. But I think, as I just said, it was ordinary citizens who very much supported the rescue effort, but their efforts obviously were limited by what they can do, and this is what I want to talk about. So it cannot just be told as a sort of heroic humanitarian story from the part of the UK government, because it simply wasn't. They put all these hurdles in the way of people trying to rescue children, and there very much was a drive also to mainly admit people to the UK who would be especially useful to the UK. So the priority wasn't saving the most vulnerable; it was admitting the most useful people. And we can argue about this. Is this a good idea? But obviously, it did mean that some very vulnerable children who had additional needs, disabilities, chronic illnesses, that they were excluded from the Kindertransport. So I want to tell about the Kindertransport and what really happened. So it cannot just be sort of used as a positive story, which it is sometimes in the UK. It certainly has been for a while, partially due to the fact that some Kindertransport refugees, former Kindertransport refugees, feel immense gratitude towards the UK, which is obviously understandable. Um, that's one aspect of it, but then I do think it's sometimes instrumentalized by the British government. They, for example, when the war in the Ukraine started, when Russia attacked Ukraine, there was a British broadcaster who said on BBC Radio, he said, "Well, the UK has a noble tradition rescuing refugees. I think about the Kindertransport." And my book's really saying, well, this is not so noble. You know, there were problems, which is not to say that individual stories aren't stories of rescue and also, yeah, of a great effort on various people, but it's just a complicated story, and that's what I want to be able to tell the full story. And as I said, new things come to light all the time.
I think of two women that I knew here in LA, and I think we should also think about what it meant to these children. I'm hoping I'm not confusing two stories, but one story was a woman who she didn't know how to fold laundry. She was, and here she was, because they had maids at home, thrown into a home where they expected her to do all this work, and she was beyond uh, unhappy. And another woman whose sister tried, and I'm probably kind of confusing two of these stories, but I know who they are. The sister tried to rescue her from a home where she was being maltreated. Well, not well treated. I don't want to say. And then I forgot what happened, and then they had to take her back, and it was the whole thing. So there were a lot of issues when the kids
Yes.
got to England. Some of them went to families, some of them went to boarding schools. How did that work?
Yeah, so basically, yeah, so they had the refugee children's movement tried to find accommodation, foster placements for all the children. So
That
yes,
was
some
part
of
of
them.
it. Wait, that
Yeah,
was
that
part of
was
it.
so the refugee children's movement was a non-governmental organization who organized the Kindertransport on the British side. There were organizations on the continent who organized the sort of transports from the continental side, in Berlin and in Vienna, and worked slightly differently from Czechoslovakia. And there's also a small group of children that arrived from Poland, but very, very few children, only about 150. So in the UK was the refugee children's movement, and they tried to find placements for the children. So there were appeals put out for foster placements. Now, as I said, it was all volunteers. So some of those appeals, they, I think, did not make sufficiently clear what actually was demanded. So there were some people who misunderstood who wanted to adopt the children. But that wasn't really the case, what their birth parents wanted, because the birth parents in Germany, it was 1938, 39, they were alive. They wanted to send their children to safety, but they didn't want them to be adopted by anyone else. So that was one problem. There were other foster placements, like you've just said, who thought, well, I take someone into my house, but I'll make them work. So especially older female teenagers, they were often asked to babysit or do housework. So that was a problem. Then sometimes they did sort of were put into communal settings, so children's homes and boarding schools. The boarding school option could be quite advantageous because boarding schools were generally private in the UK, and you got quite a privileged education if you managed to get a free boarding school place. And so, as I said, people were generous. These boarding schools, they probably thought, well, we have 150 boys, 151 is not going to make that much difference. We take a refugee boy. So, for example, the university librarian from the university where I work, the late William Bienemann, he's not with us anymore. He got a free place at a boarding school in Bristol, and thus received a very good education. But other people, they also went to agricultural training camps, so Hasharas. Hashara in North Wales, for example, there was a castle, a dilapidated castle that was put at the disposal of the Zionist youth organization, and they put off 180 teenage refugees there. And obviously the idea was they were going to train them, and they would eventually make Aliyah and move to Palestine, which obviously didn't quite happen in the way that maybe these youth organizations wanted. So they were like in a big communal setting, and there were smaller hostels and children's homes. So there were a variety of settings. The problem was that people weren't very well prepared. So even there was a minority of people who were cruel to their foster children, and there were some people, unfortunately, some people were physically and sexually abused. That's the minority. Most parents, foster parents, try to make things as accommodating as possible, but they were not well prepared. They were not prepared for the trauma the children had undergone. They were not prepared for the adjustment difficulties, the different languages. Almost all the children who arrived didn't speak very good English, and some of them, most of them, probably no English at all. So there were communication difficulties, right? From the beginning, obviously, different school system, different food, and they were missing their parents. They were young children, and they were used to living with their family and their parents. And some of the older ones, they managed to see it as a bit of an adventure. Obviously, when you're 14, you're a bit more confident living away from your parents. But there were children who were basically just toddlers. There were children who were like 2 or 3 years old. We have heard of younger cases. And
Actually,
that
my
would
husband,
obviously be so puzzling if you had to go somewhere else when you're that age.
my husband asked me, what about the young children, the very young children? I said they were carried on the train by the older children, right? Or
That
the
is
bus.
correct. Yeah. Or the trains did have accompanying adults as well, and obviously they would also look after the younger children. Yes,
I
but they're
understand that those traveling with them had to sign that they would come back.
That is correct, and but most of them did. But there's also more complicated story there. It is just really complicated. Some of them also did not. Some of them did then manage to stay in the UK. For example, the headmaster of a school for the deaf in Berlin, who traveled with a small group of deaf children. There was about 12 of them. He managed to stay in the UK. He had been incarcerated by the Nazis before, and we haven't found out exactly, but arrangements were made that he was allowed to stay in the UK. Very rare case, by the way, as I mentioned before, that a group of children with disabilities were allowed to come to the UK. But in this case, this was indeed the case. And then there were people, for example, the aunt of one Kindertransport refugee. She was an accompanying person to several Kindertransports, I think, including the one that her niece came on. But and most of the time, so some people came on more than one train. She traveled back, but eventually she was also allowed to stay in UK. And in her case, it looks like that she actually had a visa, a work visa to become a domestic servant in the UK, and that's why she was allowed to stay.
So, what do you think we should learn about from this today? Even though this is a history program, I think it's really important to talk about what we can learn about today.
Well, I think I mean, generally, what one should learn is that these sort of activities, I think, do need careful preparation. They do need the foster placements and other settings. They have to be prepared. It was literally a case also, for example, of one boy who was put in a boarding school, and he was picked up by the headmaster from the train, and in a day late, on the same day, he was sort of in school uniform sitting next to boys in a class he didn't understand a word. So I think we are probably a bit cleverer than that. We do need, people need a bit of adjustment. So I think generally, I think I think letting people emigrate with their parents is clearly, if they have families, it is good to keep families together. That would be the first point I was going to make. Then preparing would be the next point. But you wanted to ask something.
No, I was going to say, kind of like an old pond where you come to an absorption center first to be
Yeah.
prepared before being sent
Yeah,
out.
no, exactly. So I think prepare people, and also prepare the foster parents what they can expect. I think some foster parents expected a well-behaved child that would display gratitude all the time. I think we have moved on, and the way we understand children now, we do realize that children are not usually particularly grateful, even if you do nice things for them. But I think that would be important. What's also turned out to be really important is that some of the Kindertransport refugees, they were very isolated. So what turns out to be important is that they have connections to their originating culture and to the refugee community. So some of them, they were fostered in places where there were no other refugees, and that's very difficult. I think that creates psychological difficulties. If you are in contact with your originating culture, your originating language as well, it's good to keep up the first language. That's important. Obviously, giving people a good education and a purpose in life is also in the new country, in the host country, is also very important. And really, I suppose, supporting them to thrive. There were problems there as well in the UK, that some people thought that, refugee children, they shouldn't receive higher education, for example. And that led to a lot of very unhappy people, of course, because the children had come from very educated families, and they were expecting to receive a good education, and they were expecting to have opportunities to succeed in life. I mean, in general, we have to say a lot of people who work in the transport refugees did succeed in life. But there we have to give one caveat from the research point of view, is that often those people who have had quite a successful life, they're the ones we read the memoirs of people who have reasonably successful lives. Those people are more likely to volunteer to be interviewed. So we have to acknowledge there were some people who did not, and there were several people also who ended their own life at a young age because they could not cope with the trauma. So I think we need to prepare all parts well. People need to be in contact with both cultures. That's very important. Um, and yeah, I think we generally need to accept that unfortunately people will seek refuge, and they will have to seek refuge because of the way the world is, and we need to assist them as best as we can.
What about religion?
Ah, good question. Yes. So that was another issue. So the Jewish community in Britain was small. There were about 350,000 Jewish UK citizens at the time, which meant that even if most families had been willing to take someone in, which is obviously totally unlikely, they wouldn't have been able to take in all these children. So most of the foster families were non-Jewish families. And we have found documents that made, especially in the Jewish from the archives of the Jewish community in Vienna, that made the parents. They asked the parents, I suppose, to sign a document saying they'd be willing to let their child live in a non-Jewish family. So for some children and their parents, their parents in on the continent, that was okay because that wasn't such an important aspect of their lives. For other parents, of course, that was not. Which does mean that possibly a smaller percentage of very Orthodox children, their parents did not allow them to emigrate on a Kindertransport. We don't know that. We don't know who was rejected, or we obviously don't know about people's deliberations. There were some larger groups. Rabbi Solomon Schoenfeld, he facilitated some larger groups of Orthodox children to come. They used the Kindertransport scheme, but they sort of come together and they were accommodated together as well. Then obviously in homes where the traditions were kept, kosher food and so on. So some, unfortunately, there's another sort of aspect of lack of preparation, because it really happened that very assimilated children ended up in Orthodox homes, and the Orthodox foster parents were horrified, as the children didn't know anything about they thought they had fostered a Jewish child, but didn't keep to any of the traditions, so that didn't work out very well. And then sometimes Orthodox children ended up in non-Jewish settings or non-Orthodox settings or in communal settings where none of the laws were kept, and they were also horrified. For example, some of the children had to stay in a holiday camp initially after they arrived with a ferry in a place called Harwich in the east of England. And then because these holiday camps were empty in the winter, so you could accommodate the children. But some of the older children, they wrote to the chief rabbi of the UK complaining that there was no kosher food, because that's obviously what they had expected, and that's what they wanted, because they felt if they didn't keep to the laws, that obviously would be detrimental to them. And yeah, so that was badly organized. And it was all a bit, some children did get religious instruction, and some of the foster parents, even if they were not Jewish, they were tried to be very helpful and arranged for instruction, and maybe arranged for some children to attend synagogues, but that obviously depended whether there was something available. And others, unfortunately, there were also attempts to convert the children to Christianity. It's a complicated thing if a child is very young and I suppose lives with a Christian family and everybody goes to church. Even if they don't demand it of the child probably will want to go to
Yeah,
church,
right.
like everybody else. And so some children were converted in that way, but there were also some much more forcible conversions, which obviously is very it's also very detrimental. So alienation from your religion is a serious matter. There were even at the time debates, even public debates in the in newspapers, what is more important, saving a person's life or saving a person's soul? So very different parties at the time had different ideas about this, and of course, um, yeah, I mean, of course, more efforts could have been made to prepare the right foster placements. However, it would also have been hard due to the fact that the Jewish community in the UK wasn't that large. About 20% of the children, so as I said, probably a bit more, a slightly larger number than 10,000, were not from families that would define themselves as Jewish. As you know, the Nazis persecuted people who had one Jewish grandparent, and that did not necessarily mean that their own parents or they themselves would define themselves as Jewish. So that there were also some children in that situation as well.
Uh, who, you talked about this sum that would be so much money today. Where did the foster family get that money?
Uh, that is a problem. In some families that was the case, but were there were wide variety of sources. Some very rich, wealthy individuals, they managed to put up the whole sum or even several guarantees. Others, there were communities, charities, clubs, associations. They clubbed together and everybody gave, a little bit of money to raise one of the guarantees. It was often not the foster family. So online, there's a website about the children who escaped from Prague. There were 669 children who escaped from
Nicholas
Prague.
Winton.
Exactly. So Nicholas Winton aided that effort. And there's a list there on the website, and you can see exactly who paid for the guarantee and who fostered the children. And most of the time, it's not the same. It's not the same person. So people manage to get it in a different way. The Jewish community, of course, helped as well.
The money went to the government, though, right? It went to the British government.
The money was sort of held in trust, and it was supposed to indemnify the British government against any sort of expense that might be arising from the child's presence. So there's still something to be discovered there. Exactly how this where this money was held, and exactly some people, we have found some correspondence where people were sort of asking for their money back or asking what happened to it and things like that. In March 1939, the refugee children's movement had a pool of guarantees. So they had sort of a pool of guarantees, and March 1939 they had to say that they couldn't admit any more children until they could sort of one child would be discharged, obviously, from this pool of guarantees. So it was a sort of one in, one out sort of system, because basically they'd run out of money. So in my opinion, it was this sort of money, the sum of money that could be raised for guarantees, that limited the number of children. I mean, 10,000 within 10 months, that's a lot of children. But there were obviously many more children on the continent suffering persecution and who needed to find refuge outside the German Reich. So I think it was that lack of money that they couldn't just didn't have anymore, and had to sort of say. There's also issues about who was chosen. I've
I was
mentioned
going
that
to ask
already.
you if we had
Yeah,
time.
exactly. So who was chosen? It does seem to be that the refugee children's movement were the people who ultimately decided who was allowed on a list for Kindertransport. So how the procedure seemed to work, that parents went to their Jewish community and say, I would really like my child to be on this list. Then certain prerequisites had to be fulfilled: passport, health certificate, in some cases they have had a report by a social worker. These names and all these material and all these documents, they were sent to the refugee children's movement in London, and then the refugee children's movement decided whether this person was allowed
I have an
to come on.
important question for me.
Yeah.
The word passport.
Yes.
So in 1935, in September, we have the Reich citizenship law, in which
Yeah.
Jews are no longer citizens.
Yeah.
So do we use the word, and I mean passport, when we
Mm.
really mean an exit paper? Because in most cases, these children wouldn't have even had passports. Now they're stateless. So,
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question, because some of them clearly did travel on something that with the word Reisepass on it. It's a passport. That is the
right.
German word for passport. And but you're right uh, there as well. And then they had to have this identity document, which says, which I'm sure you've seen, which says this document requires no visa, and it's a little picture of the child and the names of the parents. So that's what they needed. Um, uh, and yeah, as there were reports from health practitioners and reports from social workers, if there was something that looked like the child wasn't particularly healthy or had disabilities, then often the children were rejected. And they were rejected for quite minor things like bedwetting, which is not entirely surprising that someone, would have display some behaviors, because they had obviously been under a lot of stress. Some children, especially we were especially able to look at the correspondent of the Jewish community in Vienna. There is correspondence of even rejected children whose parents had had mental health problems, and then the children were rejected. I mean, some of this correspondence almost has a sort of eugenicist
I,
aspect to it.
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
Yeah, so that's really quite traumatic, really, when you read that. But that was the decisions that were made. The first availability of foster families was also a little bit of an issue. Although I don't think they never seem to have run out of foster families, but foster families they prefer certain groups of children. The most desirable group seemed to have been small girls between 6 and 10. And there's some correspondence that states that.
Right.
Um,
I've read.
yeah, you probably have seen that somewhere. And well, I mean, to some extent, you can understand that. I mean, I have a 17-year-old son. He's 6'4". Now, when he was 15, he was like 6'3". I mean, you imagine taking in someone, a 15-year-old boy, and you think, oh my God, he's going to eat a lot and cause trouble, possibly. So you can sort of see why people think small girls might be more manageable. But of course, initially, teenage boys, well, everybody was under threat, but teenage boys were especially in danger. They were in danger as being arrested as adults and being put in a concentration camp, or being violently assaulted. So they were a lot. So the first Kindertransport actually had quite a lot of teenage boys on them, and they also were children from an orphanage in Berlin, because again, orphanages were especially vulnerable. The Nazis knew where they were. There were attacks on orphanages, and the children.
Yes, I wasn't
So
laughing.
that is really a complicated thing, and it does also seem to be that some of the volunteer social workers, they were employed well, they weren't employed. I suppose they were volunteers. They were volunteering for helping out with this scheme, that they were not very well trained, and so sometimes children. There's reports, for example, I quoted my book from a social worker near Birmingham, who reports on the foster families, and they say, oh, they're looking at a quiet child that would fit in well with their lives. They were middle-aged couple, childless middle-aged couple who were looking for a quiet child and apparently the wife was a bit lonely, so they were looking for a companion. This is as not really what we think children should fulfill, and you could also imagine how this would all go badly wrong. The parents had no experience with children. They would get a child that maybe misbehaves, then everybody would be unhappy. So lots of children had to change foster placements
I was,
quite a lot.
we only have a few more minutes, but that was one of my questions. They had to
Yeah,
change
so they had
places.
to change foster parents quite a lot because of the because the foster placement basically broke down, and sometimes, of course, the war started, families were under pressure as well, and sometimes circumstances change. Foster parents got ill, they had to take in the grandmother or something like that. So it was also, but which again was very traumatizing for children. And then sometimes children had to be evacuated because there was an evacuation scheme out of the cities into the more rural parts of the UK after the war started as well. So again, another trauma for a lot of children.
So I have really two questions. What were the ages that were acceptable? And then I understand that at this age, while the British were still locking up aliens and the enemy aliens, including Jews, before they realized how their language skills, etc. I understand that some kids went from foster homes directly to be interned when they hit a certain age. Is that true?
That is true. Yeah. I so the ages were initially children were allowed on the list when they were under 17 and under. And then some children obviously had an 18th birthday while they were on one of the lists. So then they lowered the age to 16 and under, because then, you wouldn't have that complication that you had given a place to
Yeah.
someone who had just turned 18. So that was one thing. But yes, some uh, teenagers who were admitted as teenagers, who were rescued through the Kindertransport scheme a few months later, when they obviously had a birthday, and when the internment started in the UK, were interned. Some of them were even deported to Canada and Australia on these sort of some attorneys were deported, and different people describe different things. Some people seem to have not minded living in an internment camp because they lived with older refugees who were kind to them, who also educated them. There's some very educated professors, artists, scientists in internment, and some obviously were highly traumatized by the internment experience.
So it is a very, very, very complicated topic. I mean,
Afraid so.
it looks Kindertransport. What's the big deal? I mean, saving the Jews, but after that, they just
Mm.
skip off to Holland. I mean, well, they do go to Holland and then the UK, and everyone lives happily ever after. But that was not true, and I
That
think
was not
that
true. And then one thing is also, we don't know exactly how many people were reunited with their families. But even that, which you think is the ultimate positive story, was not a positive story, because there were so many years had elapsed, 5, 6, 7, 8, up to 10 years had elapsed since they had last been with their parents. And then, the 4-year-old was a teenager and obviously a completely different person. So it's very, very complicated.
I thank you very much for sharing this complicated story with us. I hope that perhaps I've read a few books about some of these things, and I hope that people will read your book and read some other books, because I think this is a really important topic for us today to understand in terms of refugees. I'm not political, not saying anything here, just saying that we need to think about these things today too. So
I think we
thank
do.
you.
Well, thank you very much.
And I'm going to thank our listeners. And I do have to end before I lose my voice by saying, may the memory of the victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever.